welcome. My name is Stacey Cram. I'm the Policy Director here at NAMATI, and I'm going to be facilitating today's webinar, which is the second in our March Sustainable Development Goal webinar series. Today we've come together for a brief introduction to the Open Government Partnership, or OGP, and to discuss how we can leverage advocacy work by bringing together and building partnerships between reformers inside of government and outside of government. We'll also learn about broader methods that OGP employs and take a closer look at a specific country's plan. We're joined today by Tanu Basu and Paul Masson from the Open Government Partnership and Maha Jawed from the Office for Access to Justice with the United States Department of Justice, and by my network colleague teams Tobias Eigen, Ashley Van Wees, and Maa Redding, who will field your questions. I'd also like to introduce everyone to the Global Legal Empowerment Network, as this may be one of your first times interacting with us. The network is a growing community of more than 900 organizations and 3,500 individuals from around the world who are working to advance justice, be it in land rights, citizenship rights, the right to health or education, or any other sector where injustice persists. Our members include human rights activists and grassroots organizers, advocates and educators, lawyers and community paralegals, researchers, policymakers, and public servants. Through the network, practitioners from all regions and disciplines come together to collaborate and learn from each other, both online and through in-person events. How do we do this? The main way is that Network Connect is through an online discussion platform, which you can access from your laptop, tablet, or smartphone. Here we discuss problems and share ideas, solutions, and opportunities. We have a category on OGP and access to justice, and we hope to continue many of the conversations from today on that platform. We also learn from each other through webinars like this one and face-to-face learning exchanges, the leadership course, and other events, all which we announce on the platform. And there is an online library, which today has more than 1,000 free resources, such as training materials, monitoring and evaluation tools, case management forums, academic research, and specific resources dedicated to OGP. And last but not least, we do advocacy. Collectively, we have campaigned on issues such as the Sustainable Development Goals and also around greater inclusion of access to justice in OGP. So you can join the network by clicking on the link on your screens right now. Membership is free, open to all. You just have to complete a sign-up form on our website, and we will be inviting you on the post-webinar contact as well. So now I am pleased to introduce Tanu Basu and Paul Masson from OGP. They're going to be followed by Maha from the Office of Access to Justice at the US Department of Justice. So Tanu, I'm going to hand over to you.
Big thank you to the NAMATI team and you for organizing this. Now, we would like to use the next few minutes really to walk you through the stories and mechanics of what makes up OGP. But most importantly, we want to invite a conversation on how we can work together to promote more transformative reforms around the shared agenda of priority issues that we will be discussing today and beyond. I'll start our presentation today with 3 stories from different parts of the world. OGP, after all, as you'll discover as you engage more, is not so much a big anonymous international platform. We like to think of it more as a movement of reformers in government and civil society who want to make institutions and processes of government more transparent, more accountable, and more accessible and responsive to all citizens across thematic and policy sectors. A lot of the thematic and policy sectors that Stacey just mentioned, the Legal Empowerment Network also talks about. Now, the 3 instances I'll share with you just now highlight the value add that OGP could bring as an advocacy tool. Because as all of us in civil society know, we really need to use every tool we have at our disposal to get results. These stories also touch on different aspects of SDGs, Goal 16, and access to justice writ large. So legal empowerment, ensuring a voice for marginal communities, and delivery of legal rights for all, expanding access to institutional structures and systems, streamlining law enforcement and public accountability. Our first stop is in Latin America and in Costa Rica, and the circle that should be transparent really is where a large population of indigenous people in Costa Rica live. Now, language, and as you know from different parts of the world, indigenous populations often face a lot of discrimination and lack of access due to things like language barriers, being in a relatively geographically isolated location, lack of resources, and very importantly, being excluded from decision making that directly affects them. And that have made them, in Costa Rica, that made them one of the most underrepresented and underserved populations. And while they, on paper, had the right to be consulted on projects that affect them, this right that was recognized by international conventions signed by Costa Rica legally and was actually binding, had historically been very conveniently overlooked by subsequent governments. Now, that was the problem. So what did sort of civil society do in using OGP to address this? Now, a dialogue between government and an association of indigenous territories called Rica was included as one of the several commitments in Costa Rica's OGP National Action Plan. This spurred a conversation on what a consultation mechanism for indigenous territories could look like and what the implementation of such a mechanism would be. Now, we must remember that Costa Rica had signed this sort of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention that mandates a free, informed and timely consultation mechanism 23 years ago. And it took 23 years, and then after that, less than a year after making the OGP commitment, there happened the creation of a consultation mechanism for indigenous people that finally started. It's also important to remember that while having this consultation mechanism was a win, that outcome wasn't just the creation of the mechanism that was great, but the stark improvement in public service delivery that this region saw after the communities began to get consulted. There were new measures, policy measures put in health, housing, and water, among others. So this is just talking to the commitment that I just spoke about, which is sort of putting a dialogue mechanism with indigenous people, and subsequently what happened in the implementation of that commitment in the OGP National Action Plan. Now we'll move on to a different continent now. Next slide, please. One of the things that I'll talk about at the end is sort of how OGP served as a catalyst in Costa Rica and overall in having some of these policy advocacy ask state route. Now I want to move on to a different continent. Next slide, please. And I'll keep the narrative of this story short, since it's one of, where one of your network colleagues in South Africa have worked really hard and are better placed to speak about this. Now the problem here, next slide please. The problem here was that the community advisory offices in South Africa are a support structure that perhaps many of you are familiar with, and some of you on the call must have worked on as well, that help ensure access of legal services at the grassroots level. But they not often and not always have had the requisite resources to keep their work scalable and sustainable, and haven't got the institutional recognition to be able to work at scale. Now, one of your civil society colleagues happened to be at a meeting when they heard about OGP, and they decided to test the OGP platform out back home. When they returned to South Africa, they discovered that the National Action Plan consultation process was underway. And by the consultation process, it's sort of a formal dialogue process that the government and civil society have when the OGP National Action Plans are developed. Now, your civil society colleagues there heavily engaged with government and other civil society colleagues working on this, and got a commitment added to the action plan that provided for the institutionalization of these community advice offices as part of the wider justice network. Now, this would help ensure that these advice offices are a permanent feature at the grassroots level, but also institutionalization would help ensure that necessary resources that they need or the skills that the officers would need to be equipped for further advocacy, communications, and policy work is provided in a timely way. And this would also be a step forward in recognizing the community offices through a legal framework, through legislation or otherwise. Now, the interesting thing about South Africa, as compared to Costa Rican story, is the South Africa commitment is still It was just passed last year, so it's still at the implementation phase. And as civil society, we know that our work doesn't often end in advocacy. And often our expertise is what governments rely on to implement and scale programs and to ensure that it really reaches the right communities. And so how successful South Africa will be in implementing this commitment will also partly depend on resources, technical expertise, but also on how well they collaborate with the civil society partners who drafted this commitment along with them. The last story is from Indonesia. Now, what was the specific problem here that civil society and government reformers decided to address? Now, citizens in Jakarta and other parts of Indonesia face daily harassment, high costs in terms of time and money, and lack of systems that provided even basic services and lack traffic enforcement, something as simple as dealing with traffic charges and violations. There was a lack of transparency on how local law enforcement officials worked, what their mandate was, what costs associated with different charges are, etc. Now, what was done is that Indonesian government and civil society together added a commitment in their OGP action plan on police reform that sought to promote transparency, accountability, and public responsiveness in the police and public prosecution service. The commitment provided the mandate to publish information at the officer level, costs for different violations and mechanisms, among others, and to publish it online on a regular basis. Now, most of us have lived in countries where citizens are made to go through an institutional maze in terms of where to go for recourse of grievance redressal when rights are not fulfilled, but also where our interface with legal and law enforcement institutions is very painful and often open to harassment. So this commitment looked at making traffic violations and information online, cutting out the middleman, and making it more streamlined for the average citizen. Now, what do we see from these three stories, and what is really the value add of OGP? First, as we saw from the South African story, OGP puts civil society at the heart of the policymaking process. It really elevates your policy ask as a priority on the policy agenda of senior leadership in government. Second, and as we saw in Costa Rica in conjunction, it helps concretely advance the spirit of Goal 16 through the OGP process and the commitments made. So giving a voice to the voiceless and ensuring that they're able to participate in policies that affect them. Third, as the Indonesian and Costa Rican stories demonstrated, OGP served as a catalyst really that opened up a window to push for broader reform, produced concrete results on conversations and promises that have been going on for years, even in other international fora. And last, that each of these stories provided a very different entry point on these set of issues, from a more rights-based inclusion discourse in Costa Rica to setting up systems to expand access to justice in South Africa, to ensuring the rule of law institutions work transparently for all citizens without harassment or loss, as in the case of Indonesia. Now, the ask is purely defined by civil society and government in partnership in every OGP country. So it's not OGP that pushes a standard, but civil society and government in every country that work together to decide what's the best for them. As we think about this further, I think it's worth going into really what does the OGP platform mechanics look like, and what does this mean for the issues that we work on, and really, most importantly, how you can participate. And then hand over to Paul to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so let's turn to the basics of OGP. You've heard through the stories that Tonu shared a few reforms that have come about through OGP. And now let's move to the story of OGP itself. OGP was started in 2011 by 8 governments and 9 civil society leaders that had the idea that, not surprisingly, governments need to serve its people and not the other way around. Back then, even more than now, there were 2 trends gaining traction at the same time, moving in opposite directions, if you want. On the one hand, the positive trend of openness in space, where we see and saw a surge of access to information laws and the rise of open data and more vocal citizens that engage and interact with government, often using mobile phones and social media. But on the other hand, there's the trend towards less openness and less space, where trust in leaders, not just the political ones, is at an all-time low, and where institutions serve the autocrats more than the people, and where the space for civil society to operate is under threat. In that frame, the idea of OGP was simple. It was to promote the trend of openness by creating space for reformers inside government and inside civil society to improve transparency and accountability and responsiveness to citizens. The idea is that if you give champions in the system space with high-level political backing, you can make big steps forward. Governments are, in our thinking, much more likely to be effective and credible if they open the doors to public input and oversight. So today OGP is a partnership of 75 countries and a few thousand civil society organizations across the globe. And at the heart of the model is a national dialogue between government and civil society and other actors to identify national priorities around transparency, accountability, and participation. These priorities are then turned into a finite number of concrete and ambitious commitments that countries lock down in so-called national action plans. Progress on both the process of participation and the quality of it, as well as on the delivery of those commitments, are independently monitored. Our independent review mechanism checks if the dialogue was good, to what extent commitments were actually implemented, if they were ambitious, and if they actually opened up government. Other core elements to make OGP work that are crucial are things like recognizing that countries have different starting points. The starting point of Malawi is different than the starting point of Germany. But priorities that are shaped by reformers of the country can stretch each country beyond current practice. What the stretch looks like is context dependent. So it's not about mimicking or adopting some best practice or global standard, but it's about recognizing context and promoting the importance of cross-issue and cross-border exchange and innovation. And the third one that I mentioned before, the high-level political backing, is essential to make it work. So that's the national level, the core of OGP. But it's supplemented by a layer of international level activities where OGP presents a growing community of reformers who share good practice and support and inspire each other, challenge each other to be more ambitious, and leverage each other's networks and expertise where needed. So OGP creates, in a way, a platform where big ideas and pledges that political leaders like to make at international fora can be turned into real traceable commitments. Now, this community of government reformers and civil society reformers, these countries together have made 2,700 concrete commitments since the beginning on a whole range of topics. It goes from access to justice to access to information, from open data to open contracting, from asset disclosure to social audits. And the recently launched Paris Declaration sets an agenda for the coming years of what we think are the big ticket open government challenges. So the holy trinity of OGP, if you want, is dialogue and commitments and accountability. And that's also what makes it interesting for civil society and for the people on this call, hopefully, because in short, the things that make OGP unique are there is high-level political leadership and buy-in for this agenda, this model. Civil society gets a permanent seat at the table, which in many countries is not a given. It is a model that's not about vague pledges, but concrete commitments, action-oriented. And there's independent oversight, giving accountability, but also comparable data on performance on all countries. Now, that all sounds great and appealing, but does it work? It does work for civil society overall. When we surveyed the civil society community late 2015, they said they were overwhelmingly more positive about OGP. More actors were getting involved over time, and over 60% of the community said that OGP plans match with the majority of their own civil society priorities. It works best when some things come together, when political will and smart civil society, advocating smartly, urgency, the right expertise, a couple of these elements come together. But crucial for it to work is the mix of smart, coordinated civil society working with government to define and sometimes commitments. So how can you engage? How can new civil society actors to OGP engage? And how can you use OGP to get what you want? A few examples. As I said, the development of national action plans is the most fruitful moment in the OGP cycle. 7 of them are doing it for the first time, which often even creates a better opportunity because you can be the first one to help shape what OGP is in that country. In those places, you can come in and help facilitate robust civil society participation and push on some of the low-hanging fruits and immediate advocacy wins you might be working on. So those are potential quick wins where you can push for commitments in your countries and your issue areas. A more advanced option is that to strategically coordinate with partners working on similar issues in other countries on commitments, and to see if you can get tractions on an issue in a set of countries at the same time. This model is particularly interesting if you have a set of countries that look at each other, for example, in a region, and progress on topics needs a cross-boundary approach, for example, on aid transparency, or signing up to international standards, or beneficial ownership. So this approach can help raise ambition and create peer support opportunities. For example, you can partner with others working on the SDG agenda to ensure implementation and accountability at the country level. A concrete entry point for follow-up from this webinar could be to work with colleagues like Ma and Stacy to see how the set of collective actions on access to justice, the Paris Declaration that OGP countries signed in December last year, can be used as advocacy entry points for assured policy action through OGP. And the third example is you can provide knowledge resources and share technical expertise with governments and civil society organizations, even if you do not have the capacity to advocate yourselves in the process. This can be either at the national level, or you can be part of building a bigger global community of practice through global events, working groups, peer exchange opportunities, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So summarizing this part, you can advocate for change at the national level, do the same but in a set of countries working at the same time on a similar topic, or you can bring your knowledge and expertise to the community and help build a community of practice by bringing in new actors, issues, or perspectives. So the next slide gives you a sense of the countries developing new action plans and the one that have an asterisk behind them and the ones doing so for the first time. So I hope you've gotten a good idea of what OGP is, what it has achieved to date, and how it could be a helpful platform for you to advance your causes. It provides you a seat at the table, it delivers concrete commitments, and it has accountability built into it. Two final thoughts. I challenge you to test OGP in the countries you are working in, or if you're a global network in one of the countries you're working in. And second, I hope you don't see OGP as a duplicative mechanism or additional work. You really should see it, as Tonu was saying in the beginning, as another tool you have at your disposal to deliver and accelerate your objectives. We're in no means, for example, suggesting that this replace any justice action measures you are advocating for with governments. You should see it as an opportunity to put your advocacy asks into a concrete plan that ensures time-bound and accountable delivery in collaboration with you, civil society. So for me, OGP is an opportunity to deliver on a country's SDG commitments or access to justice promises that are promised under international treaties. As OGP, we want to help create and strengthen access to justice mechanisms. But to do so, we need your advocacy and technical expertise to do it. And in return, what we can offer is a delivery mechanism that has proven its value in over 70 countries.
That's great, Paul. Thank you so much. And as I've said, and then Maha will make another plug, we really do hope that this community can take up that challenge that you've outlined. And I know that a number of our members have already begun, and we'll share more of those resources after as well. And now I'm going to turn over to Maha Joaid from the U.S. Department of Access to Justice to talk about the country experience and how they've been able to use this in the United States.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I'll focus my remarks on how in the U.S. we've connected our domestic access to justice activity with OGP and describe both the collective action that we proposed in December of this past year that Paul alluded to, and how we've linked our national commitments to that activity. So in 2016, the Global Summit was hosted by France, and its outcome document called the Paris Declaration was proposed by the co-chairs France and the World Resources Institute. And through that process, they put forward the notion that the activity could be enhanced by the inclusion of collective action paragraphs suggested by governments or civil society organizations. And if you go to the Paris Declaration, you'll see at the very end, there is a paragraph that describes what exactly these collective actions mean. I won't read it verbatim here, but I'll just note a few of its key phrases, noting that it's non-binding, voluntary basis when a country or civil society organization joins these collective actions, and that they are to be done so to the extent permitted under a government's own laws, and that OGP government members, when they participate in new collective actions, that they work with civil society to ensure that these actions are reflected as commitments in their current or future national action plans. So many countries and civil society organizations proposed and joined collective actions, and the U.S. did both, including this one you see it on the slide on access to justice measurement. It's quite wordy. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I'll certainly be providing an overview of what we were intending to do here. So we're proud that it received much interest. There are 17 joiners or participants who signed on to this collective action, 5 governments and 12 civil society organizations. So the thrust behind this collective action relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular Goal 16, which obviously many of you on this call will know much about. It goes by many names, and most commonly the Peace, Justice, and Good Governance Goal. Importantly, OGP has been a supporter of the SDGs, and the OGP countries at the time when the SDGs were adopted jointly issued a declaration in support of them. And in fact, in that document, there was a reference to Goal 16. So we've also noted that document in this collective action. It's at the very end. As many of you know, as many of us know, the SDGs presents an opportunity for all countries, no matter their level of development, to come together to end extreme poverty. And one of the main drivers to ensure that this happens is through measurement. And of course, measuring this work is tough, and that is certainly the case with respect to measuring justice. The 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals calls for the creation of international, regional, and national indicators for all of its goals to help track their progress. And while the identification of international indicators is being handled by the UN, the development of national indicators falls to each country, and is in that area of the work that this collective action seeks to support. This commitment on this slide endeavors to create a space for governments and civil society to share their development of national level indicators through peer-to-peer information exchange, which we'll also note is called for in a May 2016 UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Resolution on Legal Aid. So at the OGP Summit in Paris, we held a roundtable discussing this collective action. Again, thanks to Stacy and Namati for joining that conversation. And there was some good interest in the room, and I'm certain it led to governments and civil society organizations' decision to join. Since the collective actions were adopted at the conclusion of the summit, there already has been some activity. As the sponsor of this collective action, in the first instance, the U.S. has reached out to all of the other participants who have since joined, and we've suggested to use the OGP regional meetings and the annual summit as venues to meet and exchange the information we seek to share and learn, when possible, and that during the times we can't meet in person, that we communicate virtually. And Namati, a proud member of this collective action, I believe, has offered its wonderful platform to support this communication and to exchange information. So let me share what it is that we are doing in the U.S. that we believe can plug into this collective action. It's terrific. You see this poll is happening right now, and after it's done, you'll see the final slide, but there's no urgency to get to that slide. So in the U.S., our third National Action Plan was released in October of 2015. As Paul showed in a previous slide, our next National Action Plan is to be due this year. And in our third plan, the U.S. included for the first time a commitment on access to justice. We committed a federal interagency effort that supports legal aid, which we call the Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, or LAIR, to engage with civil society and make its resources available to the public. So let me describe a little more about LAIR and then explain more how it connects to the collective action. LAIR was launched and staffed by my office, the Office for Access to Justice at the U.S. Department of Justice. And the shorthand of it is that many of the problems that key federal programs seek to address for underserved populations have legal solutions, but acting on them often requires the intervention of a lawyer. I believe many of the individuals on this call certainly know that well. And so the premise of LAIR is that many of these federal programs can be improved by including a legal aid component, ranging from self-help resources so individuals can represent themselves to full legal representation by a lawyer. And so providing legal assistance to those being served by these programs is the heart of what LAIR is doing. And perhaps of most interest to the audience here is the fact that LAIR is tasked with helping the U.S.'s implementation of Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Agenda. We have a toolkit and our first report issued in November, available on our website, which will be listed on the slide, and it's terrific. We have about a third of you who are joined the collective action, so 2/3 more to go, and we hope you'll do that at the end of today's call if feel interested more. So in any case, the report and our toolkit are available on our website. You should feel free to download them when you are able to. You'll find in the report that there is a good description of our OGP-related activity. It includes an appendix listing our engagement with civil society and an overview of what it is we were seeking to do there. In September 2016, in our update to our third National Action Plan, we called it 3.1, we again had an access to justice commitment, and this time it was specifically on measuring access to justice in furtherance of the mandate to do so by the SDGs. This is what we were talking about with respect to the collective action. So my office, with our colleagues at the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics, that's the lead statistical office at the Department of Justice, launched a working group on access to justice indicators and data collection to identify and develop national level indicators to tracking and achieving Target 16.3. It's the part of the Goal 16 that promotes the rule of law and ensure equal access to justice for all. Since that time, we had a civil society consultation to get feedback on how we should go about doing that work, and we've been moving forward with strong interest and support from access to justice experts across the country. And in January, we issued a fact sheet that's also posted to the website on this slide that summarizes what we've been doing and includes assessing our existing data held by a number of the federal agencies that are members of the interagency effort. And it also includes an announcement by our colleagues at the Bureau of Justice Statistics of a new civil justice survey initiative, which holds the promise of developing national indicators on access to justice. More information about what that exactly looks like is again in the fact sheet on the website. So this collective action would enable the U.S. to share our own ongoing efforts, both to help others attempting to develop their own indicators and, of course, to help ourselves as we do the same.
Thank you so much, Maha. I'm now going to open up for questions. This comes from Heather, and she was talking about the repercussions that might be for states who do not implement the commitments that are made in their action plans. We know that often there's grand ambition in policy, but it doesn't always lead to implementation. So maybe we can talk about either repercussions, but also a little bit wider. I mean, encouragement of that implementation as well.
Stacey, I know you suggested me. I happily, the one part of the National Action Plan that I know most about, we're hopefully doing what we've promised to do. So I don't know what the repercussions are, but I'll say that obviously there is a shaming factor that's inherent in most of this multilateral work. But let me maybe turn over to my colleagues within OGP. They may have examples that might be more helpful from other countries.
I mean, the key aspect of OGP, as you heard already, is not so much that it is a punitive mechanism, but more sort of a mechanism that celebrates reformers and is race to the top is what we want to promote. So we do have carrots and sticks for organizations, both on how well they do in the process, on how well they work with civil society, on how great their commitments are, how well they're implemented. The sticks are more in terms of more implemented by the steering committee as a peer-to-peer shaming mechanism, the way Maha talked about, as well as mechanism that civil society uses to sort of call out when something has been implemented or not. So it's not a black box when you're suggesting an OGP commitment that your policy or advocacy ask goes into a black box and you don't quite know what's happened to it. But because of the independent reporting mechanism that we have, and that's something I want to talk about a little more in context of this, the independent reporting mechanism is the autonomous sort of monitoring and accountability mechanism that Paul had referred to in his slide that OGP has. So that is the teeth in OGP. So when a country develops a national action plan And in the 2 years that it implements it, the independent reporting mechanism works with in-country researchers as well as government agencies that are implementing the plan, as well as civil society who are actively monitoring its implementation to see whether a commitment is specific enough, to see whether it's open to government, to see to what extent it's been implemented. And then that data, it's really up to country and civil society and media on how they want to use that data, whether to shame their government, whether to push their government to do more, etc. Now, there is something called a OGP response policy that exists, but that's not so much in terms of whether a country fulfills its commitment or not. But that's a stick that is there when a country acts in contravention to what we call OGP principles or process. So if we feel that a country hasn't really done anything on OGP for 2 years or 3 years, then the response policy kicks in. Or if there is complaint from civil society that civic space is rapidly shrinking, that they are unable to access resources or participate in any civil society activity, including the OGP process, then the OGP response policy is an option they have that they can trigger for OGP to sort of start an investigation and take action. So it was under this, for those of you who are familiar with OGP over the last few years, Azeri civil society used this as a way to sort of call attention to shrinking civic space in the country, and Azerbaijan was made inactive in OGP. So it's not so much on sort of for commitments. In short, it's more sort of the IRM, that's the teeth that can be used further, but on process and civic space, there are other sticks that are available to civil society.
Paul, I might direct this one towards you. This question is anonymously being posted, but it says, were you surprised over the last year with the expression of citizens' frustration with the status quo in democracies? What lessons might we, as open government advocates, learn about how not to be surprised by the populist feelings until it's too late? So I guess really speaking to this rise in populism that we've seen and the crackdown and shrinking of civil society spaces, and how might open government react to that, the OGP, react to that moment in history?
Personally, I wasn't surprised. I was surprised by sort of the election results and referenda results in countries, but the rise of populism, the further decline of trust, the inequality in tensions in society is not a 2016 phenomenon, right? It's a longer term phenomenon that you see back in things like, trust in institutions declining, not just in politicians, also in business leaders, also in NGOs, also in media. There's been a trend that's been going on for a very long time. Civic space is deteriorating in a lot of countries. If you follow the Civic updates on it, you know that I think they reported last year in over 100 countries some of the fundamental rights were challenged, including in quite a few OGP countries. So in that sense, I don't think there's any surprise. I think what is challenging is sort of that the intensity of what we're seeing in the US, what we're seeing in Moldova, what we're seeing in Hungary. The intensity is rising, which means that as an open government community, I think we have to step up our response as well, which is one of the reasons why this webinar and talking to this community is so important, because I think one of the risks the open government community has is that by focusing on an agenda that resonates well with professional civil society, or that resonates well with transparency advocates, is not necessarily helping in restoring trust in government and in changing the culture of government. Transparency is an important, great first step, but if you want to address the elements linked to populism, if you want to address the inequality, the citizen distrust, then you have to make sure that an open government agenda, and in the case of OGP, that means national action plans, have to have commitments that are about participation, that are about having commitments that go to the heart of topics that citizens care about, which might not be releasing open data sets on A or B, but which might be about, I don't know, social audits in education, or about access to justice, or about transparency on political campaigning and finance around it, but then combined with very solid investigative media. That's one part of the answer. So I think on the OGP side, I think the kind of commitments that end up in action plans and the kind of actors that push for these commitments on both government and civil society side have to be more cognizant of the issues that will really make a difference in citizens' lives and that will actually help addressing the core of what's wrong in our societies. So that's one part of it, and I think that's the most important part. The other one is, which is way bigger than OGP, is that it really comes down to the participation element of OGP, dialogue element of OGP. I think any of these tensions in society cannot be solved merely by technocratic solutions. It really is about dialogue, about listening, about reaching out, and trying to truly understand where the other side in the conversation is coming from. We've seen that in OGP in the early days when sort of for the first time government and civil society sat down and started talking. That was very often very uncomfortable because how the model worked before was civil society was advocating from the outside, government was doing what it wanted to do, and now they were around the same table trying to figure out what their shared language, their shared narrative, and their shared objectives could be. I'm making it a bit more black and white than it is, but those early conversations between civil society advocates and governments were not easy either. So that would be my response.
I wonder, just picking up on what you were talking about, how OGP can be used to facilitate this better partnership. Maha, I wonder if you could actually speak on your experience in working with civil society and maybe bringing together actors in government and civil society that hadn't worked together in the past to develop some of your metrics and some of the different agencies that you've worked with.
Certainly. It can be a new area. I mean, I'll just note that our office, the Office for Access to Justice, is an office that's focusing on legal services both in the criminal context and in the civil context. And being part of the Department of Justice, which is the federal, generally viewed as the federal prosecutors, it's a bit unusual to be an office that's opening its doors to defenders. Obviously, there's long-standing good collaboration between the federal defenders and the federal prosecutors. I don't want to imply that, but I mean to say there has been, having a clear place for the defender community, no matter where they fall, state, local, tribal, federal, to the Department of Justice had not been as clear until the creation of my office. And likewise, with respect to civil legal aid, there wasn't a clear portal for that community to access the Department of Justice or really other parts of the federal government. And so, in fact, our office has been working very diligently to enable activity and collaboration, conversation between these communities and our agency as well as other agencies. So on the civil legal aid side, I'll note that the reason why our colleagues at the Bureau of Justice Statistics have announced the creation of a new part to an existing survey, which is the National Crime Victims Survey, is because data on the civil justice side is just not collected in a way that's been steady or constant that could develop meaningful indicators over time. And there certainly is data that's collected by different parts of the federal government, and that might shed good light on different aspects of access to justice in certain areas, like with respect to victims of elder abuse or domestic violence. The data will be in some ways random, or at least will seem to highlight certain issues more than others based simply on the way data has been collected by one agency as compared to another, which then turns itself or lends itself to be able to create an indicator. So I'm not a social scientist, I'm a lawyer. I don't claim to understand exactly all that goes into identifying good data and or indicators, and that's why we brought in our colleagues who are experts on these issues to help lead us in understanding how to go about this work. So to be clear, the launch of this working group was only announced in our update to our third national action plan. So that was this September of 2016. And we've been working since actually August trying to proceed. So it's a long process, and if where we are, where we are is that we are looking to develop a new tool to collect information and data. That means we're a few years off from really being able to know what that data is going to be saying to develop indicators. And as is described in the fact sheet at the website that was on the slide, justice.gov/LAIR, you'll see what's sort of envisioned there, and it's a long process where we'll intend to, again, engage with experts. You know, my colleagues at the Bureau of Justice Statistics have rigorous approaches to how to develop and collect data and analyze it. So, in fact, there will be a larger process underway that will help to identify the right questions and you know, the right methodology, et cetera. And so all of that can't happen but through collaboration with experts outside of government. That includes civil society experts, including academics, and experts more broadly who don't generally look to come to government to talk about these issues because over the years there hasn't, again, been this portal for them to come to. But I'll note our annual report that we issued in November, it lists all those activities that we've engaged in with civil society, including in our participation in national and regional conferences across the country, some at the international level, and then also a number of civil society consultations that we've participated in. One most notably was this September, hosted by Open Society Foundations, but organized by the National Center for Access to Justice at Fordham Law School and Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute. And we've also held a previous consultation related to the Universal Periodic Review for the U.S., slightly out of the OGP wheelhouse. This was a few years ago that American University's Washington College of Law hosted for us. And that was on access to justice more broadly, so not really tied to the measurement piece. This was even pre the 2030 Agenda's adoption in September 2015. But all to say, we've always believed and understood that the expertise from the access to justice community was necessary for us within government to identify our priorities and how to best move forward in this really difficult work. Measurement is always difficult. Measuring justice has often been given a bad rap because it is so difficult, but it's not impossible to do. And for a long time, the conversation around measuring justice has really been pushed to the back and silenced. And what we can really appreciate from the 2030 Agenda is that by Goal 16's inclusion, the conversation around measurement and indicators is now thrust upon us. Even those who were somewhat skeptical are now in the room and wanting to listen to understand what we might be able to do to measure Goal 16, and for our purposes, 16.3 in particular.
Great, thank you. A few quick fire questions for the OGP crew. These are a little bit more technical. So we have one from Merv, who's from Turkey, who's asking if Turkey is still inactive in OGP. Another question is how to activate the OGP's response policy and weaknesses in the OGP IRM, independent review mechanism. What to do if civil society believes that there is weakness in the reports that are being produced by the OGP. Fourth question there is where people can get more materials on open budget as well as training opportunities. I'll make a plug for our network, but from the OGP side of things as well.
So Turkey is still inactive. It's important to mention that Azerbaijan is inactive because a concern was raised for the civic space situation, the civil society situation in the country, and that led to the country being made inactive. Turkey is inactive for a different reason, technically in OGP, which is they joined OGP to develop the first action plan, but then went silent. So they just didn't do anything in OGP, which is the reason why Turkey is inactive. So both are inactive, but for a different reason. For Azerbaijan to come back, they have to solve the civic space situation. For Turkey to come back, they basically have to start engaging with civil society again and develop a new action plan and submit it, and then they can come back into the partnership. The response policy, as Tonu mentioned, I mean, the response policy is really for the worst cases across the globe, like Azerbaijan, where civil society or international actors or government feel that a country is not living up to the values and principles of OGP, of open government, and then they can trigger a concern that will be investigated by the steering committee of OGP, and then either it will be dismissed or it will be acknowledged, and then follow-up actions will come for the country to act on it. If that's if it's a good opportunity or the best next step for civil society, for example, to take in whatever country, I think is this a step you should take in the US? Is this a step you should take in Mexico? Is this a step you should take in Turkey? That's a discussion for national civil society actors. Information on how it practically works, if you want to raise a concern, can be found on our website. The IRM reports, how can you engage a civil society? There's a couple of ways. I mean, the two important ones are, while the report is being drafted, the researcher will speak to most involved civil society as well as the government to get their perspectives on what worked, what didn't work, etc. After that, there's a public commenting period where the draft report is out there for public comments, and then the researcher will look at those comments and incorporate them where he or she feels they should be incorporated. And the third one, I guess most important, is for civil society, once the report is out, to actually work with media and use it as an opportunity to call the government out on, compliment it on what it did right, but also challenge it on what it didn't do right, and use that as the entry point for the next national action plan. On more materials and open budget, Stacey, I'll let you do your plug. On our side, one of the strong partners we work with is the International Budget Partnership. They are a founding member, actually, of OGP, one of the organizations that started it, and they have a lot of material on their website, but they also, obviously you can also reach out to them, or because it's an organization with partners in different countries, you can reach out to budget transparency specialists in different countries.
This is from Amal, who's asking about how a new country can get involved in OGP, how civil society can lead that process. She's asking this question from India, so she's also not sure if India is already involved in OGP.
On the OGP website, and we can send this with the follow-up material, eligible countries are scored on the 4 eligibility criteria that OGP have, so access to information, asset declaration, budget, and civic engagement. And you'll see more explanation on these criteria on the website. For a country to be eligible, we need a letter from the government saying that they would like to join OGP, and then they sign on to the Open Government Declaration and they agree to abide by it, including, consulting civil society on the action plan and all other requirements that we as OGP have. How countries have become eligible in the past is different ways. For the founding countries of OGP, the way it found us, the government sort of took a lead role. In some other countries, civil society takes a very active role in getting to convince their governments to join OGP. A great example is Nigeria most recently joined OGP at the London Anti-Corruption Summit last year. And it was purely due to some very hard, effective advocacy from a coalition of civil society in their country saying, we are eligible, we need to join because these are goals and principles we aspire to. India is very much eligible to join OGP. The Indian government has so far not joined OGP for reasons they might know best. However, the civil society engagement with OGP is pretty active. We've had civil society organizations and actors from India come to every OGP event. In fact, a couple of civil society leaders from India were also part of the founding steering committee of OGP. So, civil society in India very much take part in peer learning, peer exchange, knowledge exchange activities that OGP provides, as is every other country. So, it's good if the country is eligible and part of OGP, so there is a formal process of developing an action plan together. However, there are still avenues for civil society, even in countries that are not eligible yet, to participate in the broader global aspect of OGP's activities.
That's great. Thank you, Chanu. And being wary of time, I am going to use my prerogative to wrap things up and thank everyone for the presentation and thank everyone for those questions which have come through. As I said, we're going to be moving this discussion onto our online platform. If you also look on the NAMATI website, you'll find examples of where our colleagues have joined OGP steering committees and how they've been able to push forward access to justice reforms. There's more there on the South Africa example that Tonu was talking about in her presentation, and I will link to that because I think that's one of the most exciting that we've seen so far from the legal empowerment community engaging with OGP at that very grassroots level. So if you've enjoyed this webinar, I highly recommend you join us next week for the third part of our series in our SDG webinars. We will be looking at a new advocacy toolkit, SDG 16 and Justice. It actually goes a lot into how to use OGP for national reforms as well. So I would encourage you to sign up for that webinar, and we hope to see you next week. And as I said at the start, our network is open to all, membership is free, and we'd really encourage you to sign up and log in as soon as possible and continue this conversation in the OGP group. And we're really hoping that we can work together to push the needle on access to justice in OGP and see the collective action that was made in Paris really turn into concrete actions in OGP countries and also places, as Tonu just finished up, where civil society are working for the same goals but aren't necessarily a member of the partnership. So I'd like to thank everyone as a final time and wish you all a good day wherever you are, whether you're finishing or starting up.